what I want to bring to the conversation this evening is really about what we're going to be talking about: layered security and defense in depth. And this is dovetailing somewhat into what Arani was mentioning, and definitely considering some of the points that Sharon was bringing around privacy. And so talking about two different concepts and all of the different defensive technologies that you have access to and you should be considering as part of your overall security program. I'll be ending that with also a quick checklist. We're talking about startups and small businesses. What are the first places you should start? How do you take care of them? And obviously, you'll see that there's a lot of information here to ask questions and to figure out what could be the potential next steps. So when we're talking about layered security, we're really talking about these different levels here. And it goes from the perimeter, what we often think about as a physical location, which right now has changed dramatically with everyone working from home. But what's that perimeter? So if it's your business and you have a server room, a data center, whatnot, how do you protect that perimeter? And then we go down to the network. Again, that's been transformed a lot. What are those mechanisms that you can do to protect that information, your assets, while they communicate on a corporate network, home network, and the internet? We get to the endpoints, and the endpoints is really whatever device you happen to be using to access that information, whether it's a laptop or a mobile device. And obviously, to access that information, you're using applications. So there's another layer of security there that we can apply. And this is really relevant to the different types of information. As Sharon was mentioning, if the information is public information, then you don't need necessarily to apply the same level of security and protection as if it's confidential or some of your sensitive information there. And how do you deploy this if you need to? We've been mentioning a lot about the investments and the efforts. Where is that information? On what critical assets can you find it? And that's where you can hopefully come up with an initial scope. But all of this also then goes into defense in depth. Defense in depth, as Arani was mentioning, is about more than just the technology here and the different layers. It's thinking about how do we plan this? What's the governance? And what are our policies? Then moving into, we want to try and prevent as many bad things as we can from happening. And then how do we make all of this operational? So it can be a nice theoretical exercise. We can present you a lot of ideas here, but how do you, the rubber meets the road. How do you put this in place? And finally, we're mentioning it has to be monitored, it has to be maintained, and you have to be able to respond. So these are the different aspects that we're going to be talking about. And so we'll go back to the different layers, and I'll add quickly some information here. So think about the perimeter, your network or your perimeter defenses, the firewalls, the intrusion prevention systems, the DMZs and whatnot. So I'll go quickly on this because, again, in the current situation, a lot of this has been changing. We then get into the network security. For this, think about your network is now extended to remote offices, to everyone's homes. So how can you protect that information and wherever it may live, whether it's on your local laptop or on a corporate system? You need to think about identity and access. So who has access to the information? What can they do? And where can you go with this information? So it can go from identity and access to the different firewalls. We're now using these collaboration tools. And where can your people go for web proxy content filtering? We've unfortunately seen some news as well where students are now working from home, but they've been also seeing pornography or other types of contents that students should never have to see in a classroom context. So all of those have to be thought out as well. And then we get into, really the rest of the network, your wireless security. So is that done at home? Not necessarily in the exact same way that you would do in a corporate office, but there are definitely tools and mechanisms that need to be put in place with proper encryption and restricted access, for example. Moving into the endpoints, again, identity and access, who can use your computer, who has that password, what do you do, the desktop firewall. A lot of the systems nowadays, if you think about a Mac or a Windows device, it will have a firewall that can be enabled, that is oftentimes now even enabled by default. Those are good basic measures that you should be using. So when you have those questions about any application that says turn off the firewall or disable these security controls, definitely speak to someone about what's the risk that you're adding by turning off some security features. One of the other main threads that we have here is anti-malware antivirus. Obviously, there's a lot of malicious software and links out there. These are one of the basic tools that need to be implemented on the different devices that you use, simply to block the constant stream of, unfortunately, there are attacks, and as it was mentioned earlier, everyone can be a target. It's not just a question of, are you a bank? Are you, this large company? You're connected to the internet. You are now a target. We get into patch management. Hopefully everyone knows this, maybe loves to hate it as well, but it's how do you keep your systems up to date and hopefully reducing the amount of vulnerabilities with the different software you use. There's also endpoint security enforcement. The term here is really to try and understand what are the technologies that you can use to ensure that, for example, the antivirus is enabled and up to date for everyone working at home, that they are patching their systems, that they're being connected and implementing and enforcing the different tools and policies that you need. So we then get to, we're changing layers again to the applications and how can you protect your applications. Web application firewalls. It's a different type of firewall. It's really specialized in what's your application. If it has a web interface and you're asking for username and passwords, you're asking for credit cards, it can ensure that someone is not trying to use or modify your web pages and get to inside your system, starting collecting sensitive information, which would then could get into a privacy breach. So we need to take a look at those. If you're a company that's doing custom code, you may need to look into code testing. There's dynamic testing, there's static testing, different types of ways of looking at your code and the application you're building to see, have you included any vulnerabilities? Because obviously, if you can create better code, there are less chances that you're going to suffer a breach, or if you're selling the software, that one of your customers is going to suffer a breach. We also had mentioned data loss prevention. This is a tool that will really link to the next layer, which is data security, around what information do I need to protect, and let me ensure that the information can only be saved or be transmitted in the areas or to the person that is actually supposed to have access to that information. Again, we can get into social insurance numbers, credit card information, other personal data that you can classify within these tools and then control its distribution. Obviously, all of this is to protect the information. And some of the ways, and I like, Sharon, what you were mentioning around, the data, do we need to keep it? Obviously, if you can reduce that footprint of sensitive information, the risk is reduced. You're also reducing the number of critical assets that, those are the crown jewels, and what do you need to protect? But you still will have some sensitive information. And even if that's internal, you're looking, what are your financial projections? What's your roadmap? If you're doing mergers and acquisitions, all of those plans are very sensitive to your business, your customer records and whatnot. So you need to protect them, whether it's with encryption and enterprise rights management. Again, even if you're a startup or you're a small company, you have a dozen staff, it doesn't mean that everyone should have access to all of your company's information. So all of this has to be considered. And we were thinking about the technology, but now we need to look at where do I start and how do I do this? And as Arani was mentioning, we get into these different portions here around policy management, prevention, and the operations and monitoring and response. I'll go back to all of this, and this is where we're getting into some of these, and I want to highlight again what you need to do. So I'll just bring all of this to the screen. Security governance. Arani was mentioning this, and then moving into policies. Even if you're a startup, you're a small organization, you need to decide what's critical and what are the steps that you're going to take. It doesn't need to be a 50-page document. It doesn't need to be very long, but this will go a long way to help everyone in the organization understand what are the priorities, what's critical, and what are the next steps. So this will then drive your security policies and the compliance. Think about this, and especially these days, what are the minimum activities that are non-negotiable? What are the things that have to be put in place to ensure that the information is secure? And I'd say as well as that this goes back to, again, some of the things that were mentioned earlier, it's good for your business, right? You're putting those minimal practices in place and you want to be able to share them. Another point that's really dear for me. Oh, sorry. Hearing some folks there, if you could put yourself on mute. So one of the things that is also very important is to think about nothing's going to be perfect. Even for banks and large organizations that have substantial budgets and experienced teams to implement all of these controls, they still think about when things will go wrong, and it's not an if, it's when. They have to figure out what's the escalation process, what's the response process, what will we do when things go sideways. And so at a minimum, you need to think about that. So, and this goes then into security awareness training. You think about what are the policies? What's the escalation when things go sideways? What do my staff need to do? And this applies even if you're working from home, right? So what happens with someone, their computer has stopped working, they seem to have been hit with ransomware, or it's just a malware and they got a pop-up from their antivirus. What should they be doing? Trying to figure it out on their own, who do they contact and when, and what are the first basic steps? And also think about the fact that maybe now you're working from home, there's some extended time when people are going to be working, right? They have children around, the schedule has been changed, so 8 to 5 may not be the new normal. They may have an incident when no one's around. So what should they be doing? And being able to get them somewhat prepared and saying, okay, something's very odd with your computer, just disconnect it from the network, turn it off, call us and wait for our instructions. Sometimes that might just be the best thing to do. So I'll get into the basics of the technology. We've figured out this, right? And what are the things that you need? Really around antivirus, anti-malware. I've put it, and I've used the one for the perimeter security, but all the layers that are available to you, and it's really going back to what are you using in your environment. So you have email, it's in the cloud, look for a provider or look for that provider. For example, if you're using Office 365, they do have antivirus for Exchange. They do have protections for your email. Enable that. Put in the configurations, spend some time with that. And as Arani was mentioning, if you don't have the expertise, don't have the time, get someone to help you. At the content on the endpoints, obviously things will happen. People will use USB keys. They will access the internet in different ways. You need to do that at your endpoint as well, because that's oftentimes where all the interaction with your data will happen, is on a mobile device, on a laptop. You need to figure out what you're going to do. To reduce the attack surface and the risks, patch management is key. Again, thinking about this, that we're now working from home, are your tools still working? If they were really optimized for an office network setup and haven't been thought about with now mobile devices, and how do you do this if you've authorized your employees to bring your own device? You do not manage their devices anymore. So this may become more of a situation where you need to train them and make sure that they at least have the basic understanding of how to maintain their own systems. Virtual private networks. If you are accessing sensitive information, if you do have remote access capabilities into your corporate systems, they're not necessarily in the cloud, they're on site, make sure that it's encrypted, make sure that that network connection is private, because again, we can't ensure necessarily that everyone's Wi-Fi network is safe, that the other devices that they're using have been secured. So at least this technology can also seclude or segregate the device that is going to access your corporate network and corporate systems from everything else and ensure that's secure. So added layers here. Identity and access management, that's what the acronym stands for. I mentioned it before, controlling who has access to what and what are those levels. The other thing I'd say with this is enable and use all of the strong authentication mechanisms that are available to you, especially if you're using cloud services. Again, I'll talk about Microsoft, but it's relatively easy to turn on two-factor authentication. It's the same thing with Google Documents and whatnot. So it's a good way to prevent accidents. If your account has been compromised, someone has clicked on a phishing link, they may have harvested your username and password, at least with those one-time passcodes that show up on your phone or on another device. They can't easily get to that. So it's a good layer to think about. And obviously this is critical for your system administrators to really have that, because they typically have the keys to the kingdom, and it's something you need to look into. So this is pretty much the overall view, and I'll summarize this here just as a recap. I know this is going to be shared through the recording, but I just want to make sure that you have an idea of where to start, because it is, a never-ending game. There will always be bad guys that are thinking about new and interesting ways to abuse systems and play with your emotions to figure out ways to access the data that they want and to get to the results that they want. So we can't let our guards down. We need to continually understand what's going on and put new tools in place. So build your structure, with governance and compliance and security awareness, because your staff is really the key to success, because you can put in the best tools. If they try to figure out ways to go around them, it's not a successful venture. And then improve your capabilities over time. You've seen that fan there, and by the way, that was originally built by Northrop Grumman years ago. But I feel it's a good representation of what we're talking about. And so start with some of these key technologies here and then grow from there. If you already have them in place, then ask yourself, can you identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, right? So can you detect when bad things are happening? Can you ensure that your systems are functioning properly, that everything is maintained, and then, again, planned for things will go wrong. So how do you respond? How do you recover? So you're not in those situations and being part of the statistics of, unfortunately my company was hit by ransomware and the backups, I just found out they didn't work. So I'm hoping to pay the ransom and get my data back, but if not, I may be out of business. Unfortunately, there's a large number of small businesses that are victims to that and just don't recover. So testing those things is really key. And I'll repeat the message again. Find a partner that you trust to help you. Have those conversations, figure out what this plan is, and keep putting things in place and it's a marathon, right? Every day, every month, you try to improve and this. And thank you for your time. Let me get to, if anyone wants to reach out and have a discussion, get more information on what we do with endpoint detection and response, it will be our pleasure to have a conversation. Obviously, we have the breakout session and looking forward to your questions.